Welcome, guests. Thank you very much for participating in today's Facebook Live event. My name is Karen England. I'm a landscape architect with Metro Vancouver Regional Parks, and I'm your host for today. I am also a gardener myself, and I'm always happy to be able to share what I know with others. Today, I'm here to share sustainable gardening practices and talk about the Grow Green Guide, which is a web-based resource created by Metro Vancouver and the UBC Botanical Garden to support gardeners in our region. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of local First Nations, and I am personally very grateful for the example they set for making strong communities and living a life in connection with nature. And today, particularly, I would like to thank the Musqueam First Nation because we're having guests today from the UBC Botanical Garden, which is in their territory. Today is the third installment of the 6-part 2024 live stream gardening series. You can follow us on Facebook to check out our upcoming engagements. There's also a calendar of upcoming events on the Metro Vancouver events calendar. Our theme today is climate-friendly gardening. We are celebrating part of Biodiversity Days that's happening all May in honor of the May 22nd UN Day of Biological Diversity. We would like to also share with you our free gardening resource called Grow Green, which can be found at growgreenguide.ca, that shares sustainable gardening practices, has information about plants that grow well here in our particular climate, and has free downloadable garden plans that you can search by drought tolerance and general adaptability to help you find the right plant for the right place, which I think is something that we'll be talking a little bit about later. I'd like to introduce our guests for today, Rhonda Type and Terrell Ralston. Welcome very much. Thank you very much for being here today, and you're very welcome to our program today.
Nice to see you.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Maybe Rhonda, would you be willing to share with us a little bit about your background and why you're so passionate about horticulture?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island, which is a very fertile valley for agriculture. Specifically, I grew up in Cowichan Bay, right across from Mount Zuhalem, which is the back of what we now call a very, very endangered ecosystem, the Garry Oak Meadow on Mount Zuhalem. So I grew up with family all around who were all gardeners, and so it was kind of a natural progression. Moved to Vancouver in my late 20s and have built 3 different gardens here in Vancouver, and now I volunteer with UBC Botanical Garden as a FOG. I'm now 30 years as a FOG, and also Master Gardener here in Vancouver for 30 years. So I've been involved in for a long time.
That's a lot of experience and a depth of knowledge. And for those who aren't aware, the UBC Botanical Garden has the Friends of the Garden, which that's where the acronym FOG comes from.
Right.
Very active in supporting what happens in the garden.
Yeah.
Trell, maybe you would share with us how you managed to get yourself into horticulture and maybe a little bit about the research that you're doing at UBC.
Absolutely. I grew up on an organic farm in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia. And so from a young age, I was, cultivating and propagating plants. And that sort of led me into my interest as a biologist and as an ecologist. I now really specialize in pollinators and bees in particular, and how we can help support communities and support plants and gardens by utilizing native pollinators. And I also do some research here at the UBC Botanical Garden, looking at how climate change is going to affect where species are able to exist in the future. So, things such as drought, as we're going to be talking lots about today, how that changes the habitat that those plants are able to live in. And I also, just want to plug really quick. We are joining you outside today at the garden center at the UBC Botanical Garden, where we have lots of different plants for sale. And so before we even get in, I just wanted to plug that really quick. It's a great place if you're looking to have any additions to your own garden to come find some of our local native plants and as well as garden
Yep.
plants in general.
Thanks, Tara.
I'm always impressed by what's at the shop and in the garden. You can find things there that you can't find other places, not just your true tried and true favorite plants, but also things that are a little bit harder to find. So I never go by the garden without stopping in and picking up something at the shop. So thanks for the plug. I appreciate the plug, Trail. Question for you. I'm not sure which of you would prefer to answer this question, but today's topic is climate ready gardens. What does that mean to you?
Well, I can.
Yeah, go ahead,
maybe give it a
Rhonda.
try. To me, it's gardening has become kind of a new normal, and it's about creating diversity in our gardens such that the flora in our gardens attracts pollinators to diversify diversify and create biodiversity. It's about reducing lawn size. It's about not growing as many monocrops as we used to, like a lawn, or like hedges, long hedges of the same kind of crop. What we want now is a mixture of plants that support wildlife in the garden. And that's, of course, based on the climate changes that we face. Especially in the Pacific Northwest, we have long, hot, dry summers that are just getting longer and drier. And then we have winters where we have flooding, in the valleys. So our gardens have to be able to cope with those huge extremes in weather.
It's a very tricky problem. I know for where I work at Metro Vancouver, we set the watering restrictions for the region. So we are limiting the amount of water that people can use for watering their lawns in the summer. Back to your point about getting off lawns, that is something that we support also through Grow Green, to remove your lawns and maybe plant with more resilient species that are hardy and durable throughout the summer. It's good not only for water use, but also improving biodiversity and encourages pollinators.
Exactly. And we also encourage, the use of rainwater capturing vessels, like barrels and things like that to keep around the house. And also, it's really important to have containers in your garden that allow wildlife, the birds and the bees and the butterflies to drink from. So we have to conserve water, but we have to conserve it intelligently, so it helps everybody.
Absolutely.
If I were wanting to get some seeds that I could use maybe for overseeding my lawn to make a meadow, or seeds for native plants, do you have any place in particular you would recommend?
Well, I do. We have a great selection of West Coast Seeds. It's a local company in Ladner that source all of their seeds locally, and so you can be sure that the vegetables that they sell as seeds grow well in this area. They tolerate our hot summers and our wet early springs. So that's West Coast Seeds. We also sell seeds that are collected by the FOG volunteers here at the Botanical Garden. And I've pulled a few out of our rack, and each one of them is an absolutely fabulous pollinator plant. Verbena is one, Lobelia is another one, loved by the hummingbirds. Iberus is another one that the bees love. Camassia is a native plant that grows in our Gary Oak Meadows in BC. And it's a wonderful plant. Alliums, as you know, are wonderful. So yeah, that's the UBC Botanical Garden seeds that we sell here in the shop in the garden.
You were going to plant. When is the best time to plant? And how would you incorporate water conservation when you put out a new plant or when you plant seed?
Well, when to plant is really critical, and West Coast Seeds gives us hundreds of booklets every spring that are really well detailed to specific planting. Like, for instance, you can't really put out your tomatoes yet because it's still a bit too cool at night. Whereas you plant your peas, you know, pea seeds and things like that really early on in March. So it really depends on the seed, on the plant that you're sowing seed for. And but if you're sowing plants, or if you're digging in plants in your garden, new plants, the best time to do that is in the spring when it's still the soil is still really moist and cool, or in the fall when we get rainfall again. But the worst time really is during the middle of the summer. And of course, that's really important so that each plant develops a good root system. And of course, a good root system is absolutely necessary for any plants, but in particular for those drought tolerant plants that we expect so much from. Yeah, they can't be drought tolerant if they don't have a good root system established for transpiration.
And that can take a bit of time to develop.
Yeah, it can take months and years, yes.
Yeah, I've always been, in my practice, I've always given plants additional water for the first year or two until that they're really well established before I set them out on my own. It's like could I maybe anthropomorphize them? You wouldn't take a baby and not nurture it for the first couple of years before sending it off to school. And you have to nurture a young plant for a couple of years before you can set it off to cope on its own.
Absolutely. It's probably it's one of the biggest mistakes new gardeners make is, you know, they come in and they ask about what plants are drought tolerant, and we have to remember to explain to them how important it is to just get them into the ground and give them some tender, loving care the first year, and not to expect too much from them for the first year.
Yeah, it takes sometimes people grow things from seed and they don't realize that for some plants, it's gonna take several years for them to reach the mature state that they had in mind. Yeah, but it's certainly a way to save some money and to be more connected, I feel, with the plant if you've grown it from seed.
Yeah.
I know that when we were speaking earlier, you had some ideas about being very careful about how you locate plants and to make sure that you've got the right plant in the right place. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about what you mean by that, right plant, right place?
Yes. Well, I'll just explain that I sit on the UBC Hort line, which is an information line. It's been around since 1976. And so we get a lot of calls from new gardeners or horticulturists asking that very question, like, you know, what plant I know I've got a sunny backyard or a shady backyard, or, you know, I've got a patio that faces north. What can I plant in that area? So you really have to gather a lot of pertinent information from them before you can give them the right answer, because there's no point in suggesting that they grow, you know, lavender, for instance, on a north-facing patio, because they need at least 7 hours of sun a day. Same with vegetables and fruit. When you're growing any kind of fruit or vegetables, you need at least 7 hours of sun in your garden a day. So for people, you know, who have a north-facing garden, it's going to be really difficult to produce, you know, good mature fruit.
So many of the plants that we use for food are plants that want to be in really sunny conditions, I find.
Yeah,
It's harder for me to design a shade food garden than it is for a sunny garden.
Hmm,
It's not that they don't exist, it's just that it's trickier, I find.
exactly. Yeah.
Would you say then that generally native plants are more adapted to climate change or the kind of changes we're expecting?
Absolutely. And that's why our native plants are such great pollinators, because native plants, at least to the Pacific Northwest, I'm not talking native plants from, Wisconsin or South Africa or anything, but really native plants to this area are so well suited because they've been growing here for thousands of years, and they've been managed safely by Coast Salish First Nations for thousands of years. So they really are well suited to the area. And for that reason, they develop good pollinating flowers and pollen.
And if I can just jump in on that as well, our native plants have evolved along with our pollinators here, and so there's special relationships between those pollinators, and then there's also our native ecosystems in general. That for example, birds that might migrate through Vancouver in May are expecting fruit from certain species. That if we have a non-native species that maybe fruits at a later time in the summer, that's a food source that's not there for that
Yeah.
bird. And so it's quickly becomes a cascade for a number of different number of different species.
So important. Yes, I agree.
I've also recently been in meetings with some members of some local First Nations who reminded me that for 10,000 years or more, First Nations were also tending the local ecosystems. So in a way, some of the biodiversity that we experience here is through their land management practices
Yeah,
over thousands of years.
exactly.
Yeah, you've got something there, Trill. Did you want to show us something?
Little bit of show and tell. This is one example of a plant that has been stewarded and propagated by indigenous people. This is Malus fusca, or Pacific crabapple, and this is a really important tree for indigenous people in the area. And there's a lot of evidence to say that it was actually migrated along with indigenous people when they came across the Bering Strait, 10,000 or even maybe even longer in history. So, this is one shining example of that.
Mm-hmm. And we have, I mean, as a hiker for many years, it's not uncommon to kind of hike into, areas on Vancouver Island or the islands around us, or, Nootka, and to find, a Malus fusca growing with apples on it, or something like Vaccinium ovatum, which is a really important evergreen blueberry that grows in the forests, and has been used for cooking and medicinal purposes by First Nations for years and years and years.
So we have our first question in the chat here. I've got a question from a viewer. Can we grow many of these native plants in containers or small spaces?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, actually I have to qualify that, because it's really quite ironic. The most native plants that we find in the woodland area in the Pacific Northwest are very, very hardy, and they grow so well in their native situation. But try to dig one up, and of course we shouldn't be doing that anyway, and we aren't, but try to dig one up and transplant it and put it into a pot, it'll die. So that's why we actually have to obtain those plants from legitimate sources and not go out tramping around and trying to dig up native plants from the woodland, the natural woodland. But so to get back to your question, they grow really well in containers when they have established good roots in a nursery situation.
Do you have some favorites? Maybe one favorite from each of you, just a recommendation of what native plant that would grow well in a container.
What do you think?
That's a good question.
Okay.
I think you could grow it in a container. I think goldenrod. Of course, I'm
Mhm.
a bit biased to
Yeah.
pollinator friendly plants, but any Asteraceae, any plant from the Asteraceae family is going to be a great source. The nice thing about asters is they're a rich nutrient source, but they also have what's called open flowers, and so any pollinator can visit that flower and get nectar and pollen from it. So that's why asters are such good plants.
They're
for that.
beautiful. I can suggest a couple that I love. One in particular, and I love ferns. I grow the Western sword fern in pots all the time, on patios, in the garden, and that is Polystichum minutum. It's fabulous, and it's pretty much evergreen unless it gets really, really hot in the summer, then the fronds will die back. Or unless you live in an area like I do, where we have deer and the deer love them, but they do really well in pots. Ribes sanguineum, which is flowering currant, is a fabulous hummingbird attractor and looks beautiful. It's a deciduous shrub, similar to salmonberry, the native salmonberry, but it's beautiful. And the same with the deciduous huckleberry, Vaccinium parviflorum, also beautiful in a pot.
Great recommendations. That should be a satisfactory answer for the person who sent in the question. That's some really good advice there. Terrell, I was just going to ask you some questions about supporting local biodiversity in our gardens and what we can do to make a difference to such a important problem. What do we mean when we talk about biodiversity, and how do you define biodiversity?
That's a great question. Biodiversity, biological diversity, is really the variety and the health of species, of ecosystems, and of their genetics. And so you can think of biodiversity, most people think of biodiversity of plants or of species, but it could also be the biodiversity of ecosystems or the biodiversity of the actual genetics of those different ecosystems. And the reason why biodiversity is so important is because plants, animals, microbes, all parts of living beings provide us with free ecosystem services or contributions to our existence that is really just so essential. And I also might add, in my opinion at least, it's great to have a diversity of flowers in your garden to attract a diversity of different pollinators or of other insects. And, because at least in my mind, it's a real sense of accomplishment to see such a living ecosystem in your own backyard. Especially moving away from the traditional sort of mindset of having, monocropped lawns or, very ornamental flowers towards having maybe flowers that are supporting biodiversity, not only bees, but other beneficial insects that might control
Yep.
pests that are on, aphids, for example, that might be controlled by lady beetles or something else like that. So.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's interesting. I was reading recently the miraculous changeover or revision of one of the biggest and most popular estate gardens in Britain, called Great Dixter. They have changed very, very, very formal gardens, hedging, perennial gardens into meadows. And so that's essentially what they're doing. They've got a big promotion in Great Britain called No Mow May. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it before, but it's really interesting. And I think it was probably instigated by Kew Gardens, which is responsible for the Royal Horticultural Society in Britain. And so it's all about, wilding. It's a term that they use, wilding your lawns and making them meadows.
In other words, being a lazy gardener is all right.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
pays off to be a little bit lazy. I think humans have this term biophilia. We're attracted to nature, and I think having a yard that's full not only of blooms, but also of living creatures that are enjoying the blooms more than we are, even like they depend on them for their life cycle, is a wonderful thing, not only for biodiversity, but also for humans and our own mental health. It's a wonderful thing to do. Speaking of needing plants for your life cycle, why are pollinators so vital for human survival and the health of the ecosystems and wildlife habitats, Trell?
So pollinators, we often think of the Western or European honeybee as being a important pollinator, and they certainly are. They're really important in agriculture for pollinating things like blueberries, for example. However, we can neglect our native bees and other pollinators a lot, and a lot of research has actually shown that they actually are contributing more to crop yields than our honeybees are. And so without our native pollinators, our food systems, not only the amount of food, but the quality, such as like the size, the shape, etc. Those are all things that would be affected if we didn't have our native pollinators. To give you one example, bumblebees are able to do something called buzz pollination, which honeybees aren't able to do. And this is where bumblebees will vibrate the same muscles that they use to fly with, and that actually releases pollen from the flower. And this is something that tomatoes and blueberries need as well. And so, without our native pollinators, the food we eat, about 1 in every 3 bites, is reliant on a pollinator to pollinate that plant. So a recent finding out of the Faculty of Forestry, Dr. Matt Mitchell, found that native pollinators in Canada are contributing somewhere in the magnitude of $300 to $400 billion annually, which is about 5% of the agriculture GDP in Canada. So it's quite a large contribution.
It's amazing how much work the bees do for us and how little respect they get for it generally. Not talking about you, Terrell or Rhonda. Could you give people some advice about how they could provide habitat for pollinators in their gardens? What are some things that we can do to make things better for them?
Absolutely. So the number one threat to our native pollinators is habitat loss. And so your garden is a great opportunity to be providing habitat for those species. And one of my biggest suggestions to people when they're selecting, okay, what flowers do I want, is knowing when those flowers will actually bloom and selecting a diversity of flowers that have bloom periods that are overlapping one another. So having some plants that maybe bloom in late March, April into May, having some more plants that bloom June, July, and then others that maybe bloom August, September, maybe even into October, it is really important to ensure that we can,
Absolutely.
support those pollinators
Yeah.
year round. We don't want just a big blooming, and then the flowers are gone. Those bees are attracted to a spot, but then they're left hanging if there's no more bloom.
What
Exactly.
happens in the winter then? Let's say that we've had a successful summer, we've had a succession of blooms, overlapping period of bloom. What can we do for pollinators in the fall and the winter?
So there's a few things you can do. One thing to know is that most of our bee species in British Columbia are ground nesters. So they live in the ground, and having areas in your garden that is exposed, bare soil, especially sandier soil that is easier for them to dig into. They really like south-facing slopes if you have that in your garden. That is going to give them an area where they will actually be able to live in the ground and overwinter. And another way that you can help them actually survive the winter is by leaving your leaves. So
Yeah.
leave the leaves is the expression.
Mhm.
And into the fall until temperatures are consistently above 10 degrees Celsius. And also that shouldn't be confused with mulch. And so leaves and other, sort of leaf litter, allows more air and allows the pollinators to actually still come out, versus heavy mulching actually really suffocates the ground and
Exactly.
deprives the ground of oxygen. And so we need to be careful when and where we're adding mulch.
And what kind of mulch? Right?
Exactly.
It could, I mean, mulch can be so many different things. It can be gravel, it can be bark mulch, it can be leaves.
Right.
And so it's important to adapt, to the area that you're serving, with the right materials.
Uh,
And in terms of the flowering plants, they have to be flowering at the same time as the apple trees, for instance, that you want pollinated, right? So there's no
Mhm.
point in buying flowers that bloom in August if you're really encouraging pollination of apple trees, which flower in late March and early April.
Mhm.
I often have this question about timing in my own mind, actually. When is the best time, for example, if I have hollow stem plants, large grasses or, sambucus or things that I know that the pollinators might be able to make a nest in. When is the right time to cut down old stems without getting rid of the baby pollinators in there? When is the right time to lay down compost without suffocating the bees that might be nesting in there?
Right.
Could you give us some advice in that area?
Yeah, well,
Go
ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is, something to be aware of. Most of these bees are going to build their nests. In fact, some of those bees, the tunnel nesters or cavity nesters, they're called, will will come out and only be out and foraging for a few weeks before they go back into dormancy. So really, you want to avoid making any cuttings, and in general for gardens during the summertime, and into the fall if you can help it. So that's when our bees are going to be nesting inside those stems. The best time would be in the springtime to make any sort of cuttings.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
I think that's
Yeah.
really just a general gardening tip for new gardeners as well.
Yeah, interesting. I have a question for you. So I have lots of grasses that I just leave, and I agree. I don't cut them until, what, maybe March?
Yeah, March. Yeah, March is a good time.
But I also put up two little insect houses, that you buy at the hardware store.
Mhm.
And I've hung them on south facing walls and east facing walls.
Mhm.
And as far as I know, the insects do not use them. Why is that?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, they're going to be doing what they want to
Yeah.
do. It's hard to actually control them. And a number of studies have looked at, for example, people might have heard of bee hotels. And
Yeah.
so these are, blocks of wood or sometimes fancier that just have holes drilled inside of them, that the bees can make their nests in. And some studies have found on average, it's about 30% of those hotels are actually successfully recruiting and holding bees. And I think also it might actually in some cases be a good sign. It might mean that there's actually preferable habitat in your garden. If you're seeing the solitary bees in your garden, but they're not nesting in
Yeah,
that
I
little
see
nest
lots.
box,
Yeah.
then it could mean that there's other
Sure.
habitat that they're finding in your garden.
Thank
I've
you.
seen people take stems, the hollow stems of the trimmings that they've got, and they place them vertically, I don't
Yeah.
know, in a pot, or
Yep.
does that help?
That definitely can work. One of my favorite suggestions, there's a invasive species in BC called the Himalayan blackberry, that is a real nuisance, and you should definitely avoid having it in your garden, as it can just choke out all the other plants. But one thing you can do if there's any Himalayan blackberry in your area is to actually cut the green stems or the new growth, and then take those stems and just dry them out in the sun. And then, like you say, in the late spring or early fall, you can either put them in a terracotta pot and then tie a piece of string around them so they're all held up nicely, Or some people, and this works as well, just stick them in the ground, right into the dirt.
They won't reroot.
No, they won't reroot. So as long as you take cuttings and dry them out in the sun,
Okay.
so that they're
Oh.
dead, then they won't reroot somewhere else.
And that gives the insect some place to nest?
Exactly.
Oh.
The pith remains
Mhm.
inside the stem, and so some bees are looking for the pith specifically as a signal for that's a good place to nest. So
Interesting.
yeah.
That is totally new information to me. Thank you.
Yeah,
very
me
much,
too.
Tro.
Yeah, like, do
Um,
you have Himalayan blackberry in Nova Scotia?
There
Because we have, it's brutal here.
it is in Nova Scotia as well. It's not as bad as out here, but
No.
there's other invasive blackberries in Nova Scotia as well. So yeah.
we're coming down to the last few minutes here, but I didn't want to pass on the chance to learn, to share with our viewers something about the Hort line. Rhonda, would you be willing to tell us what the Hort line is and how people can access it?
Sure. It's well, I'll give you a little bit of history. In 1976, the director at the time of the botanical garden was David Tarrant, and I'm sure many of the listeners remember David's name. He was the famous Canadian gardener and brought a lot of interest and fame to the botanical garden in those years. So at the time, they had hundreds and hundreds of questions coming in on a daily basis about horticulture and gardening, things like that. So David set up the UBC Botanical Garden Hort line, and it's still running today by all of the FOG volunteers. We receive thousands of questions over the years, and it's fascinating. There's about 10 of us who do it. Most of us are master gardeners, so we're also representing master gardeners as well as FOGs on the Hort line. And we love it because we always learn something. We always learn something because you often have to do research yourself to answer the question. And yeah, it's really a useful tool. I would highly recommend, you calling in if you have a question. It's really easy.
People can
We
just phone in and ask any question,
you can
that they
call
have.
in. You can call in at 604-822-5858, or you can email us. And of course, we always recommend sending in a picture, because if we get questions about plant ID or plant disease or anything like that, a picture is always really helpful. And you can email us at garden.hortline@ubc.ca.
So this is a wonderful resource. I hope people take advantage of it. Where else can you get free access to people who really know what they're doing and have good, solid local knowledge? It's a wonderful service that the garden provides. Do either of you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today?
I just encourage everyone listening to get in their gardens, start to learn their native pollinators, and don't focus too much about our honeybees. Honeybees are doing fine. Let's start to worry about saving our native bees.
There's such a wide diversity of bees. There's so much to learn. It's a fascinating area of study. I've been posting pictures of all the pollinators I can find in my yard to iNaturalist, which is a free downloadable app. And
Yes.
then if I don't know what it is, someone will get back to me and tell me what it is. And I've been just amazed at how much biodiversity I can have in my own backyard just through my own actions. It's a wonderful thing to do. Any final words from you, Rhonda?
Well, I think I have good vibes from all of the gardeners that's come in and visit us every day. And I think most gardeners are good keepers of the land anyway. They just innately understand things that we've been talking about today. So yeah, I think that it's wonderful being a gardener and being able to share this news with everyone else. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you for that. I aspire to be a fog one day myself. Maybe one day, maybe soon I get to be a fog too.
Great.
Thank you everyone who was able to join us today, and thank you again to Rhonda and Terrell. We really appreciate you making time to share your learnings with us today. For those people who submitted questions that we didn't manage to get to, we will provide you with written responses following the broadcast today, just as quickly as we can get to them. If you would like to see some former event recordings, you can find them at the Grow Green Guide website. They're all posted there now. This is just new this week. So you can go back and see all of the recordings that we've done over the years. And I'd like to thank you one last time for tuning in today. You can join us again on June 27th for our next segment, which is going to be focusing on fire smart gardening. Until then, happy growing.